Good afternoon and welcome to today's lunch hour lecture, everybody. My name is Jack Ashby from the Grant Museum of Zoology here at UCL. I'm here to host today's talk. Very pleased to welcome Reverend Professor Michael Reiss, who is Professor of Science Education at UCL's Institute of Education, and he's also Assistant Director for Research and Development there, where his research and teaching focuses on science education, bioethics, sex education, and curriculum studies. He's also held the role of Chief Executive at the Science Learning Centre London, which was based at the Institute, and is Vice President of the British Science Association. So it places him perfectly to give today's talk. How should we deal with creationism in schools? If you could please join me in welcoming Reverend Professor Michael Reiss.
Right, so we'll do the shortened version. We'll do the shortened version of the context now. It's important to take account of the fact there are quite a lot of young people in schools and colleges who themselves would identify as creationists or come from families for whom creationism, a literal reading of the Quran or the Jewish or the Christian scriptures, is very important. That's also the case for teachers as well. There has been a naive assumption that, for example, secondary teachers of science are never creationists, and the only decent bit of work that's ever been done to look at this shows that's not the case. As you might expect, there's a range of views among teachers. Now, I am particularly interested in what we should do in science lessons. England is very fortunate in one sense in that we have in state schools large numbers of qualified teachers of religious education who've done degrees in philosophy or theology or religion, and they are very good at looking at issues and helping students to think about issues to do with the scriptures, with the history of religious communities, and so on. My particular focus, though, is what should we be doing in science lessons. So I am going to say something, first of all, about the nature of religion. It's pretty clear what to do in RE lessons. What RE teachers nearly always do is they do not act in a very judgmental way about the diversity of views that the students have in front of them. So creationists and people who have views about intelligent design, who hold views about intelligent design, are not likely to have their views ridiculed in RE lessons. Indeed, the official government-sponsored curriculum for teaching about RE in schools encourages children to learn about creationism to understand what it entails, as well, of course, understanding other non-creationist views. Now, it's terribly difficult in just a few minutes to try and say a great deal about the nature of religion, but I want to, because I'm going to go on and say a little bit about the nature of science. The reason why it's difficult is, first of all, there are a lot of different religions, so there's not a huge amount that, for example, Buddhism has in common with the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And the other reason is that within most religions, there's quite a diversity of views. That's more apparent in some religions than others, but even in religions that are fairly cohesive, there's a range of views. Nevertheless, it is the case that for pretty well all religions, there are a large number of things that are important. Scriptures are nearly always very important. So people who have a religious faith tend to pay attention to the words that are in their scriptures to a greater extent than they would about the words in any other piece of writing. Now, I know many of you will know this perfectly well, either because you yourself have religious faith or because you've got family or friends who have, but it's important to emphasize it for people who are themselves atheists, agnostics, secularists, and haven't, as it were, lived within a world where religion is very important. But it's not just scripture. There are all sorts of other things, of course. There are important buildings, whether synagogues or mosques or churches or temples. There are important objects, so for example, icons in Orthodox Christianity, Uluru, there's rock in Aboriginal faiths in Australia. There are doctrinal teachings, there's teachings about the importance of the community of all believers, so the church in Christianity, Ummah in Islam, and so forth. A whole range of dimensions about what it is to have a religious faith. Now, Science is actually a little bit easier to characterize, to be honest, although the sort of content matter has varied a bit over time. Nevertheless, it is the case that the methods of science have shifted much less. So science is fundamentally about scientists building up models, theories, concepts, trying to explain what can be seen in the material world. So by the material world, I mean things like physical objects, but also things like magnetic and electric fields, but one would not include, for example, such immaterial things as aesthetics. There is, to a certain extent, a science of beauty. You can have a science as to why certain things are more beautiful than other things in terms of human perception. But the bulk of the theory of aesthetics lies outside of the sciences in just the same way as moral philosophy does. Science has got quite a lot to say with why we as humans think certain things are good or bad, but it's not the case that science can actually say whether certain things are good or bad. That's moral philosophy, a different branch of learning. And indeed, mathematics is a different branch of learning as well. You don't go out in mathematics and prove, for example, that the sum of the internal angles of a flat triangle are 180 degrees by collecting large samples of triangles, bringing them into the lab, culturing them on Petri dishes, carefully nurturing them, measuring their internal angles, and finding it's about 179.2 with a standard error. It's just ridiculous, which is why many of you are laughing. Scientists work in different ways from people who work on aesthetics, moral philosophy, and also mathematics. Now, a bit about science and religion. I want to just introduce a famous classification due to an academic called Ian Barber, who said there are 4 ways we can envisage the relationship between science and religion. In no particular order, but in terms of being most straightforward to get to grips with, the first one can be considered to be conflict. So historically, this has not been the most important way of understanding the relationship, but nowadays, in many, many countries, including the United Kingdom, it is an important way. So, for example, Richard Dawkins would very confidently put himself in this category. Whenever science and religion in any way interact, for him, there would be a conflict between them. And Ian Barber talks about it like being a battle between a boa constrictor, the snake, and a warthog, a rather fearsome small pig. One of them ends up killing the other. The next relationship, which is very, very commonly thought of in the United States, is of independence. This is partly in the States for historical reasons to do with their constitution, but it says, look, science is all about the material world, it's empirical, it's objective, it's to do with observable things. Religion is quite different. It may be about values, it may be about ethics, it's about spiritual things which can't be tested in the same way. And for many people, that's very, very helpful and allows them to keep the two quite separate. So they might be a very strong religious believer in terms of what they do in a mosque or a church or a synagogue, but equally in their, say, professional life, they operate as an objective scientist. So conflict, independence. The third approach is a rather sort of wishy-washy term. It's just dialogue. And I'll give you one example. Modern physics, as some of you will know, has found that it is increasingly clear that if any of the fundamental constants of the universe, by which I mean things like big G, the gravitational constant, or the charge on an electron, or Planck's constant, if any of them varied, not just by a small amount, but about a sort of most minute amount, a millionth, we would not be having this discussion today. We wouldn't have a building like this today. There wouldn't be people, there wouldn't be organisms, there wouldn't be the Earth. In other words, it looks to many people as if the fundamental constants of the universe are precisely those that allow interesting things like people and planets to exist. Now, some people start jumping from that to conclusions about, well, it must have been designed. Others say, whoa, you lost me there somewhat in the logic of that. But the point is, it makes it more likely to have a dialogue between science and religion. The fourth camp, which for what it's worth is where I'd put myself, is where science and religion are in a sense integrated. Now they occupy different theories of knowledge, different epistemologies, just as I was talking about mathematics being different from aesthetics, from science, from moral philosophy. But one's life is lived assuming that there's not going to be a conflict between them, and they're both of great importance to one. So for a lot of religious believers, of course, the integrated model is the model they have, whether or not they're particularly expert in theology or science. Now, a specific. The advice I always give to beginning teachers about whether or not they should get into discussions about scriptures in science lessons is no. As I said earlier, in England, we have specialist RE teachers, years of training on these sort of things. Pupils expect they're going to be talking about the scriptures in RE lessons. Don't get into it in school science lessons. I will a bit later get onto what you can, I think, usefully get onto, but the advice would be don't get into discussions of scriptures, discussions about worship, temples, or anything like that. There are other places where that can be done better. Okay, a bit about science and creationism in general. So creationism is fundamentally the view that organisms did not all come from a common ancestor. So for a creationist, it might be that the different species of zebra come from a common zebra, because they're all pretty similar, but they did not share a common ancestor with beavers, for example, and it certainly isn't the case that humans shared a common ancestor with monkeys or with beavers or plants or anything else. Whereas, of course, for a scientist, if you accept the theory of evolution as I do, all living things ultimately shared a common ancestor, whether we're talking about monkeys, humans, beavers, zebras, flesh-eating bacteria, or Jack sitting there. All right. Common ancestor for all of us. In terms of how old the Earth is, as you may know, there's a bit of variation between the world's religions. So classically in Christianity, there are large numbers of young Earth creationists for whom the Earth, indeed the universe, would only be about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, whereas for Islam, that's just not an issue because the Quran can't so easily be read in a way which talks about the Earth being very young, whereas the most literal way of reading the chapters in Genesis that have dates in them would cause one to think that the Earth is only about 6,000 to 10,000 years. Even though, as some of you may know, the Jewish theologians and historians and the early church fathers in the Christian church were rather divided on this issue. The ones who have come down in posterity as being the sort of most famous ones mostly did not think that the early chapters of Genesis were meant to be read literally. They thought they were meant in a slightly more figurative or symbolic way. Creationism, therefore, does not basically like the theory of evolution and is suspicious of a lot of the conclusions that it reaches. So as some of you will know, creationists point out many objections to the theory of evolution. They would argue, for example, as some of you here might, that evolution is all about mutations, making things worse, not about progress. They might argue that the second law of thermodynamics, which is basically about the amount of disorder in a closed system always increasing, the second law of thermodynamics, it would be argued, means you can't end up with complicated, intelligent creatures such as ourselves from single-celled ancestors. They might argue that the theory of evolution ultimately is about life springing from inorganic matter, which is contrary to what great scientists like Pasteur found out when they disproved the spontaneous generation of matter, of life. They would argue, for example, that the fossil record is worth looking at, but that you find human fossils at the same time as certain dinosaur fossils, and so on. Now, as I indicated earlier, I happen to be an evolutionary biologist, albeit somebody with a conventional religious faith, so I think there are answers to each and every one of those, and if you want, we can get onto them in the discussion. But this comes back now to my point about the classroom. As a biology teacher, I would be delighted if a student, without being pushed by me, if a student felt confident enough to argue, for example, that mutations are always harmful, or that the second law of thermodynamics disproves evolution, because those are, if you like, scientific objections to evolution. Now, as I said, I think they're objections that conventional science can answer quite well, and I'd try and see if others in the group could produce those, or if not, I would probably introduce them myself. But that's very different from talking about scripture, which is not appropriate in a science lesson, in my view. So this is one reason why I'm very happy about creationism being talked about in school science lessons, because it can lead to better science teaching. It can help students realize that there have been objections to the theory of evolution historically, and not just from people with a religious faith, as well as them being such objections nowadays. It can help students to engage with arguments in science lessons. I'll just give you one anecdote, which is not about religion, but it sort of sits to it tangentially. When I was doing my A-level chemistry a long time ago, it was about the time when Uri Geller was bending spoons, or saying that he was bending spoons. And I remember one of our fellow students saying to the chemistry teacher, who then cheerfully, but nevertheless scoffed at her, was a bit patronizing towards her, that the previous night when Uri Geller had been on television, she had put out some of the family spoons, because he said this would work at home. It didn't just work in the television studio if you did exactly what he told you to do. And indeed, the newspapers were full of all sorts of people who said that their spoons had bent, and so on and so on. Now, the chemistry teacher scoffed at her, but we had quite a good argument. Some of us saying, well, she'd been fairly scientific. She'd done a little test. By the way, they didn't bend for her, just in case you're wondering, sort of thing. So that's an example where I think it's perfectly appropriate to talk about what I suppose we could characterize as parapsychology within a science lesson, because it gives a bit of an understanding as to how a scientist might tackle it. Presumably, if you really had found that they had bent, the next thing a scientist would want to do would be to look at the mechanism. Okay? But as I said, they didn't bend for her, so we didn't get onto that. Okay. I want to introduce now a concept which I personally have found very helpful to do with thinking about the resistance that many people who would identify themselves as creationists have to changing their mind about the theory of evolution. And it's the concept of worldviews. And I want to do it by way of just asking you a quick question. Imagine we have an oak tree which we have planted from an acorn, and it has grown over a number of years. And there's a question as to, well, where did the mass of the oak tree come from? We're talking about dry mass, so you can forget about water. The dry mass of the oak tree, the wood inside it and things like that, there's only really two logical possibilities. It might have come from the soil via the roots, or it might have come from the atmosphere. Now, if you're comfortable enough voting, I'm just going to ask you to choose between those two alternatives, and of course you don't have to vote, nobody's going to get traumatized or anything like that. So hands up if you think, well, most of the mass, over half, came from the soil. Put your hand up. Thank you. Would you put your hand up now if you think most of the mass came from the atmosphere, from the air? Thank you. I'm not sure, that's probably about 40%-ish of the people who voted for the soil, 6% for the air. Right, now the scientifically absolutely accepted answer is that the overwhelming majority, way over 98%, comes from the atmosphere, from the air. But the reason I'm asking you this is because if you gave me 40 minutes with you in a typical school secondary laboratory with some nice little simple bits of equipment, I reckon that those of you who said you thought most of it came from the soil would change your mind. You do not have, I suspect, much, if any, emotional investment in the idea that most of the mass of a plant comes from the soil. That, of course, is very different from students in school who identify as creationists. They tend to have a huge emotional investment in that idea. At one extreme, some of them may literally think that their own souls or futures are at eternal peril if they stop believing that. At the very least, they're likely to think you're trying as a teacher to separate them from their families or their culture in some way. So my experience has been that people do not rapidly, if they are creationists, change their views and come to accept the theory of evolution merely through good teaching about evolution in schools. Okay, a bit more about worldviews, and I want to do it now by talking about a film called The March of the Penguins. Just out of interest, how many of you have seen this? It's a fairly well-known film. Wow, well again, that's probably about a third of us. So it's a 2005 film. It is, in many ways, the most successful natural history documentary ever made. It won an Oscar. It's got, I can't remember the exact rating, I think it's 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, for those of you who are film aficionados. It's the highest grossing documentary of all time, and it has been an incredible success. There are many reasons why it's such a success. It is a beautifully made film. The chicks, I'm afraid, just look, if I may say, irredeemably sweet and fluffy as they wave their little wings as they grow up. The photography is just utterly stunning. And the story is pretty unbelievable. I won't go through a whole lecture now, sadly, about emperor penguins, but as some of you know, these are the birds that end up breeding in the middle of the Antarctic winter when it's sort of minus 50 degrees centigrade on a good night. And they have to walk for miles to get to their breeding sites, because if you've forgotten or don't know, these things are not good at flying, like they don't. So the whole story is extraordinary, and it's heartrending, and it's very well narrated by Morgan Freeman. But the other reason why it's been a great success is, as some of you may know, it became very popular among the US Christian right of the country. And I want to read an extract from a website called christiananswers.net, which is a very large website which gives biblical answers, it says, to contemporary questions. And there's a review of the film, which is still accessible on the internet, by someone called Mary Nelms, which gives a real insight, I think, into worldviews and their relevance to this issue. What she does is she goes through bits of the film and links them to verses in the New Testament, the Christian scriptures. And I'll read you one or two of these out. If they don't seem to make any sense as to what's going on at all, hang in there, okay? And I'll try and make it clear. So she's got a heading, friendship stroke camaraderie. And she says, all the penguins wait to start their journey until the last of them is out of the water, giving a sense of unity. As the penguins make their journey, they will all stop from time to time until one of them picks up the trail again, and then they all start moving. It is similar to what we are called to do in the body of Christ. And then there's a hyperlink to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 27 to 28, which, just in case any of you can't remember it, is, now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. And in the church, God has appointed first of all apostles, second prophets, third teachers, ... Next paragraph. While the fathers are caring for their unhatched chicks and braving the harshest of weather, they all huddle together in a huge heap for warmth. the ones on the outside rotate. Some of you would have seen films of this with time-lapse photography and infrared cameras. The ones on the outside rotate, so they all have a turn in the middle. And then there's a hyperlink to Philippians 2, 2-4. Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Now, what's going on there is that in Barber's language, this is somebody with an absolutely integrated model for science and religion. So for her, penguins, part of the natural world, the science of penguins, are a way of interpreting scripture. The thinking is as if humans have fallen, which as some of you will know is a Christian concept, the fall in the Garden of Eden. They've fallen to a greater extent than penguins. I have to say this is not a theory that mainstream theology has wrestled with very much, but that's the implicit, I think, argument that she's got, that we can therefore learn something about what God intends for our lives by studying penguins. Okay, now I'm very much in favour of studying penguins. I admit probably for slightly different reasons, to be honest. But the point is, I think you can say, somebody who understands the relationship between the natural world and scripture like that, they're not going to change their view just because I or somebody else have 2 or 3 lessons in schools about natural selections and some story about the evolution of horses getting bigger as the climate got drier. Okay, we're almost finished by now. Implications for the classroom. I've made it clear already there are distinct, though they're not contradictory, but they're distinct aims for science teaching and RE teaching. Hence my continually going on about science teachers should not start getting, whether they have a religious faith or not, they should not start getting into discussions that are better done in RE lessons. This should be completely obvious as a point, but it's just important to make. One should respect all of one's students. That's not, of course, logically the same as accepting the arguments that students put forward. Part of the job of being a teacher, whether it's school or university or wherever, is to help students sharpen their minds, develop their critical faculties, increase their store of knowledge and so forth. But a good teacher can do that in a way that is absolutely respectful of the students, even if they're trying to teach the students areas that the students don't as yet know. Now, related to that, can I make, this is the next bit I want to just emphasize, because I think a lot of science educators disagree with me about this one. My own view is that, therefore, if you have a class which has got pupils who are creationists or come from creationist backgrounds or are just very mixed up about the whole issue, the aim should not be to persuade them that the theory of evolution, by which I mean the mainstream scientific theory, is correct. The aim should be to get them to understand the theory of evolution. Because understanding it, whether or not you accept it, is worth doing for the time and the culture in which we live. It's what history teachers are always doing, for example, getting pupils to understand what was going on. You know, you do a decent study of Stalin or something like that. The aim is not to approve of what Stalin spent half his life doing, but to, at least as far as any of us can, understand some of what was going on that led to Stalin coming into power and then doing the things that Stalin did. And equally, when you study literature, you're doing the same things, understanding what the characters in plays and novels and poems are doing, not accepting all their arguments. Okay. So that's the aim of such teaching. The aim is about understanding rather than accepting the theory of evolution. By the way, the only good studies that have been done in the the only good studies done anywhere have been done in the US at college level, which shows that people who come to a college with creationist beliefs sometimes do shift towards a more scientific understanding of evolution, roughly speaking, provided two things happen. One of which is that they've got really good teachers, not that surprising, but the other of which, and remember this is done in the US, is if the teachers have a strong religious faith themselves. And I think what's going on is the students gradually begin to find it more difficult to imagine, well, I or my family are going to go to hell if we don't have a creationist belief, because here's a woman or a man teaching as my professor, who I know worships at so-and-so church, and as far as any of us can tell, seems an okay sort of person. Doesn't lead to sudden dramatic, if I can use the phrase, conversion to evolution overnight, but when you do careful methods of social science research, you find far more acceptance of evolution at the end of seminars of teaching by such teachers. And the very last final bullet point I've got here is a highly specific one. I don't think, therefore, awarding bodies, the people who set exams, such as GCSE exams, should be setting questions with, statements like, show that the Earth is 4.6 thousand million years old, or something like that. It should be more about, present the evidence that the Earth is 4.6 thousand million years old, because that is more accommodating to somebody who doesn't hold those beliefs. Any of us can state the evidence for X, even if we don't personally accept X for ourselves. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you ever so much. Questions and comments?
Thank you very much, Michael, for a fascinating talk. We do have time for questions. If you have got a question, if you could just wait for a microphone to arrive so people watching online can hear you.
Thank you. A very interesting talk. My question is, you're saying that scientists should not persuade those who are creationists in mind to change their minds, but at the same time, there are certain issues where you could disabuse them of some of their ideas. For example, you were talking about entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, and that's a misconception that you've only got spatial entropy, but in fact when something does become order like an ice crystal being formed, it gives out heat, and there are so many other ways. Would you not see there's a role for disabusing, as I say, students of some of their notions?
So two responses. Yes is the short answer to the second part of your question. I'm absolutely in favour of teachers and scientists disabusing people of misconceptions, because as you point out, that particular one is a misconception. So of course are things like human fossils and dinosaur fossils occurring at the same time. It's commonly trotted out as an argument, but I don't think it's a valid argument. I think, did I hear you say scientist at the very beginning of your question? I think you said that I was saying that scientists should not try and persuade people the theory of evolution is correct. Let me be very clear. I'm delighted for scientists to try and persuade anybody they meet that the theory of evolution is by far the best way of understanding biodiversity. My point is about science teachers in schools. In other words, with children, okay? Because it's a formative period, and the role of an educator, even if he or she is convinced of certain things, is not always to try and convince other people of the same things. Once you get to a certain age, certainly 18, which is legally when you're no longer a child of this country, frankly, no holds barred.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Behind it.
Yes, I'm a little bit concerned about the tentative nature of your present the evidence for the age of the Earth is 4. I think we have to say that all the evidence points to that, and that this is a science lesson, and I'm a little bit concerned about the potential political correctness here, which I object to thoroughly, and if it suggests a timidness that I don't like. I'd like to see science and asserting ourselves as we know what's right and believe this, and we do know better than you do. That's why we're teaching you. You're going to be tested on this, and then just as you would say that hydrogen bonds or something behave in a certain way, we're not going to be. How would you wouldn't say present the evidence for a hydrogen bond? We say this is how it works. Tell us how it works. And I don't think we should be any more tentative in discussions of the age of the earth just because we've got some ill-educated and backward cultures that are coming in here and trying to impose their effects on our culture.
So thank you for that robust presentation of one particular perspective. Now, there is actually a large part of that, in all honesty, which I do actually quite like, because I keep on saying I happen to fully accept the theory of evolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a couple of very easy responses I can make. The first one of which is, if I can be really honest, I think the evidence suggests that that way of teaching a theory of evolution is likely to lead to fewer people coming to eventually accept it than, to use your word, the more timid, politically correct way. So on grounds of utility, effectiveness, I think there's quite a lot to be said for the gentler approach. But also, I want to repeat the point I made in response to the previous question. We are talking still about children here, at least I mainly am. And, children are good at picking up when others disagree with them. And that robust presentation that you gave could, in other people's words, begin to drift towards a slightly patronizing approach to children, or a degree of condescension, or even ridicule. And I'm not in favor of that, even when one is absolutely right.
But teachers are inherently patronising, and they say, you don't stop eating, do this, go to the office, write this down, all homework done by that. That is a patronising attitude.
Now, sadly, we may not have, all of us, been able to catch that as the point that teachers are inherently patronising when they tell children what to do. We can have a long discussion about what we mean precisely by patronising, but I do belong to the slightly more sort of liberal end of education, which is where you want...
That's what worries me.
Yes, that's right. I'm not going to keep on repeating everything you're saying. So I'm going to microphone, but you're saying that's what worries me. But liberal in the sense of an open-minded inquiry that is moving towards the truth and doesn't always have to overstate the truth at every point. But we better stop there. It's getting into a nice, interesting personal discussion. Anybody else?
I have time for a very quick question if anyone's got one. Sorry, right to the back. If you could keep it brief, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Unfortunately, you heard half of it. As a Muslim, and some of the things you just said I would concur with, especially with good manners when you're dealing with young people. And in terms of young people, I think it's very important to explore the world, whatever views they may have, and to look at things in a logical basis. I completely agree with that. And for children to develop in that kind of way, rather than to dogmatically say this or that. Children also have a tendency to object and to rebel, to form their own kind of view. And it's also important, I think, to challenge views in order to make progression. If we don't challenge views, then we wouldn't have an iPhone. We'll still be having analog phones. So it's very important to challenge authority. And authority also needs to see that in a positive way, and I'm sure as a lecturer, as a teacher, educator, you obviously would see that and see where those creative forces are coming from. Sometimes objecting to authority can also go the other way, and authority don't always like that, but progress comes from challenging the status quo. But one thing I did want to say, in essence, was from an Islamic point of view. Can I just finish the one point?
Yeah.
The point being that as I understand it from an Islamic point of view, and as well as in people who have critically looked at a lot of these information, and I think it's a big subject in itself, is that a lot of our beliefs are down to beliefs. And it's very hard to prove anything. So I think that the idea is to say, I think I therefore am, because very few things can be proven. And I think we need to have much more tolerance, which I would concur again with yourself in terms of how we deal with each other.
Good.
Well.
I'm going to have to respond quite quickly, but yeah. So the bit that I would like to latch in was the last point, which I can construe as a question. One of the important things which is really difficult to do in school science is to help young people realize that science is always, to a certain extent, open-ended, has a degree of provisionality and tentativeness, but there's a lot of scientific knowledge that is extremely robust. And that is quite a difficult thing as a teacher to do, and to get people in school to talk about which bits of science are really rock solid, quite a good phrase actually, and which bits are more on the we're not 100% certain is great. And I'd like to see more classrooms with children talking about that. As you know, we've got to stop now because some vast numbers of people are going to pour in something that starts at 2 o'clock. So thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.